Next, it is death metal time, and amid a crazy month for death metal, it is death metal royalty time. We are talking about the 16th record from Cannibal Corpse, Chaos Horrific. Honestly, if you want death metal right now, there is the new Tomb Mold record, which was surprise dropped when we already had the running order for this episode in place, hence it not being here. But the death metal community has been going crazy about them again. There are more death metal legends with Dying Fetus dropping their first record in 6 years. It's hard as piss, obviously. Cryptopsy have barely gotten a look in with all of this, but theirs is pretty good, and they went even longer without a record. It might feel slightly unremarkable, I guess, to be talking instead about Cannibal Corpse when it's only 2 years since the last one that we reviewed. But not only will I just always want to talk about Cannibal Corpse, they are the definitive death metal band of all time in my eyes, but we're also here talking about the follow-up to Violence Unimagined, which has gone down as one of the most significant Cannibal Corpse records of their modern era.
I've not listened to every modern Cannibal Corpse album, but that was when that was a real kind of fuck me, Cannibal Corpse can still go with the best of them and are not showing any signs of letting these newer bands lap them or even come close to overtaking them. It was a real big statement of we're still the kings of death metal, wasn't it?
Statement is definitely the word, because everything Cannibal Corpse have done, I think, especially post or Kill and afterwards, is basically fluctuating between fucking brilliant and really good. And some of my favourite Cannibal Corpse records come in that time, like Torture, I think I've said before, is the best Corpse Grinder record for me and so on. And the Violence Unimagined, for me, was a follow-up to maybe 2 slightly weaker Cannibal Corpse records. Not bad by any means, but weaker. And then that tumultuous period and yada yada. And it felt like on Violence Unimagined, everything lined up. It was the cover was the first time in ages where you saw it and went, what the fuck? It had songs on it that were instant, fan favourites. And Eric Rutan contributing stuff. It was just you would never say, oh, Cannibal Corpse are back, because, you only wait 2 or 3 years to get a great death metal record from them. And it's been like that for 35 years now. But it was it was serious. It was, any semblance of doubt that anyone could have possibly had could just be sort of blown away with that record, I think.
Yeah, Cannibal Corpse, I believe, are the most consistent deliverers in heavy music, right? 16 albums, not one of those is less than an 8. They have crazy high standards, but while they always hit the spot, every now and then they land on one that feels really momentous for them, and it kind of chapters a particular time. The big one from the 2000s, even though I agree, I personally prefer both Evisceration Plague and particularly Torture that follow it. But Kill was the beginning of a new time period for Cannibal Corpse, where they started recording with Eric Rutan, and they came up with a whole bunch of classic songs first time out, and people went mental for it. And that whole run for a decade afterwards, you would summarise as the Kill and onwards era of Cannibal Corpse. I think in the late 90s, something like Bloodthirst of the early Corpse Grinder records represents a sort of similar thing. Violence Unimagined became another of those era-marking records. The obvious literal difference was Eric Rutan moved from being just their producer to being a contributing member of the band, and I think you can absolutely see that on the record with the songs he contributed, but more hard to quantify. People just fucking love that record. The reaction to Violence Unimagined was people having their heads taken off again and again, and still talking about how much they loved it and how amazing it was and what a milestone it was for ages. The only similar thing I've seen from a veteran death metal band dropping a release lately was the last Immolation, where all the death metal folk on my timeline went, whoa, and just kept talking for ages about how great it was, which is a real feat at the moment when everything seems to go by so quickly. But Violence Unimagined achieve that beyond anything I've seen in recent memory. I would probably say it's the best death metal record of the 2020s so far. Either that or the much weirder and slightly harder to categorize Alphaville from Imperial Triumphant. But if you are wanting all-out death metal, I think we have started another decade where Cannibal Corpse have put their foot down and left the template of this is what you're aiming for. This is the bar you got to clear. And they've toured it since. They went all over Americas and Europe in 2020 and the start of 2023. But they were secretly sitting on, basically, a whole other record that they started recording back in 2021 when Violence came out, because they weren't immediately touring it with COVID. So what we are hearing on Chaos Horrific is the direct continuation of a sort of creative state of mind from one record to another, maybe beyond we've heard with Cannibal Corpse.
Yeah, because it's a weird thing with Cannibal Corpse where people go, oh, they all sound the same. But if you're at all seasoned with them, you kind of are able to pick out the deviations in each record and the sort of different flavours that each one and each era has. And like you say, for the first time, it feels like they've put out a sort of sister record, which is weird because Bloodthirst comes a year after Gallery of Suicide, but I never put those records together. Whereas Violence Unimagined into Chaos Horrific, down to the titles and the...
I was about to say, yeah.
etc., etc. It does feel kind of like a direct continuation.
Yeah, and this album, like I've had it for a little while because I did an interview piece with Paul for Knotfest, which I recommend you go read if you want to know more about like, the inner workings of Cannibal Corpse and how they might make an album like this. But at first, it almost like overwhelmed me because it's so fast and aggressive almost all the way through.
As in my notes, it's like, is this like the fastest Cannibal Corpse record? It feels like it's up there. Like the pace of this record doesn't stop for a single second.
Yeah, and that might sound like slightly redundant to say about Cannibal Corpse, but Violence Unimagined, to me, has some of the most immediate songs in the Cannibal Corpse discography. It's an album of hits from them, basically. Like, they have really distinct identities. You listen to them. Surround, Kill, Devour doesn't sound like Murderous Rampage, which doesn't sound like Condemnation, Contagion, which doesn't sound like Ritual Annihilation, and so on. This album, like, blitzed by so fast, just absolutely beating me up and leaving me for dead, that it took a few more listens to really grasp onto the songs the way I did with Violence.
Obviously, I've not quite grasped onto a lot of the songs. There's been a few of them. Summon for Sacrifice, I think, is just fucking amazing. That is, like, just pure death metal banger. But the other songs are kind of
Until he breathes no fucking more. Someone for sacrifice.
Yeah, like I mean, that song is incredible, 10 out of 10 death metal track. And then all the other songs are just, like, blistering, like... Frenzied Feeding is another one where it's like, that is so chaotic. But I'm still wrapping around title track as well, which is another one. Where it's like the...
Well, that's the thing.
I've just got to go in it.
As you go through, you go, hang on, yeah, that's a banger, that's a banger, that's a banger. But it's their shortest record since Evisceration Plague, which, as we spoke about on the album Roulette with James from Hellripper earlier this year, is another record that like really properly rampages around you with like these like crazy bite-sized dizzying songs. Like, do you guys know what I mean about this being a particular like frantic record?
It genuinely overwhelmed me at first with just how and like it assaults you from every angle.
I think Kill Evisceration Plague is actually a really good comparison because Violence Unimagined is like a sharp, precise wrecking machine of a Cannibal Corpse record where on listen one you can just recall riffs instantly.
Yeah.
And this one is like murkier and more rabid. And I'm so happy that that's where they've gone with the follow-up because, like you say, they started writing and recording it soon afterwards. And if that previous one felt like you could have been struck down by like one beast, this is just like a monstrous horde. Like the first couple songs, it's so like overwhelming. And one thing I think that's different on this record as well is that Cannibal Corpse, I wouldn't say the word predictable necessarily, but on the last few records, particularly Skeletal Domain and Violence Unimagined, it was like you could listen to the songs and go, oh, they're going to do that next, they're going to do that next, and it would deliver and be really satisfying. I love when Cannibal Corpse go down that more like dizzying route, like you get on the first four records and some of the like Gore Obsessed and Torture and some of the ones since. And this sits more in that camp. And it might be their most like unhinged record since Torture or even Evisceration Plague. And you could go on phrase about like how long they've been doing it for. But it is unreal that 16 albums in, we are talking about songs like Chaos Horrific and Frenzied Feeding as like your new material, because it is just fucking, it's wild.
Yeah, with the singles were both more of the mid-paced tracks on the record. Like Summon for Sacrifice was the second single, and it has faster passages, but it has that kind of sinister, intent, sort of slow slayer through death metal, really lurking thing. Bloodblind is like the biggest outlier on the record in a way, because we spoke that opening groove is unbelievably fucking heavy, like absolutely staggering. Like when they do Scourge of Iron, you go, how is that real? What the fuck? Like that's the kind of shit that Cannibal Corpse do better and heavier than anybody else at any point in history. Like the steamroller riff that makes you feel like you've actually died. But it really stands out on the record. The first couple of songs feel more like the more representative songs, and they're just fucking batshit. Like I love the bustling intro in Overlords of Violence, where like Alex Webster's bass really gets the limelight, but it has that really like thrashy, like in a really, you know, recognizable, going all the way back to like Eaten Back to Life, Skull Full of Maggots or whatever type way of just like flying at absolute fucking speed, and there are those really old school moments where, like, there was a little bit of that on Violence Unimagined with Inhumane Harvest, I think, had a kind of bleeding-esque quality to its riff, but Vengeful Invasion on this goes for the really, like, the higher end with the riff, like that really, like, fucking frantic swarm of bees flying in your face thing right off the bat, and it really comes at you. And then when they switch up between that and the low grooves in such a fun way, it's stuff like that that makes you, like, pay attention, I guess, more than, like, death metal bands who are just playing consistently with one kind of tone.
Vengeful Invasion is genuinely mad. It sounds like the Antichrist crossed with Flight of the Bumblebee. It's like, you try and, like, imagine learning that song, you're like, I don't know where the riff begins or ends. It throws you off balance so great. And then when the riff change kicks in, it's like you're being knocked down the stairs. It's like having a light going off really fast in your eyes. It's like, it's so disorienting. And it's just such a great tool, because when, like you said, when Cannibal Corpse do want to kick, no one can kick harder. And as fast as this record is, and almost unwilling it is to slow down or have those moments, when it does supply them, they're all the more, like, primitive and punishing for it.
I mean, Vengeful Invasion, it sounds like the death metal version of the sort of frenzied, chaotic hardcore I love. It's like death metal every time I die at points, in the way it's kind of just so, like, not that, like, direct comparison, but that it's got that approach to the riffing of that, like, every time I die, chaotic hardcore that I just go for. Even like it's like southern twang slightly in the guitar sound, but it's just death metal version of it. So they're just soaking it in blood and gore and just grooves that could cave your skull in. And it's such a, like, crazed song on that regard that I think, like, how like at this stage here, Cannibal Corpse still hit it with so much, like, vigor and aggression, and don't have any sign of, like, we're not, you know, easing off in the slightest. I think it just is like, God, it's impressive on that front.
Yeah, I mean, Vengeful Invasion, I think it's an interesting track lyrically as well, because it's telling the story of basically a victim of human trafficking who goes on, like, a violent revenge and kills all the people who've been trafficking her. And there are moments where they go slightly more real world in a way, and then it's on an album next to Pitchfork Impalement, and there's there's a brilliant run of album tracks as well where that, like, Vengeful Invasion, the title track, Fracture and Refracture, all just go crazy fast. Like, the title track maybe a bit groovier in a really, like, lively, tossing you about way. Big shout along part as well. Fracture and Refracture has that, like, repeating snare fill that's a bit like a drum hook for it that anchors you. And the guitar playing is, like, I mean, this is considering the unbelievably high caliber they've always operated at, but I think the solo sections are maybe the most obvious part where Eric Rutan has kind of got a clear influence, because, like, that guy's played in Hate Eternal and Morbid Angel, you know, like, the melodic edge that he gives to solos in, like, Frenzied Feeding or whatever is where you go, like, damn, that is just, like, absolute creme de la creme.
The Eric Rutan Rob Barrett axis on the last couple of records is so fucking cool, because, like, Pat O'Brien, like, an unbelievable player, and like, nothing he wouldn't be able to play, but I don't think he necessarily had the same knack for, like, infernal, demonic, tritone solos that Eric Rutan brings to it. And it's something
that dive bomb solo section in Overlords of Violence.
Yeah.
It's like, oh,
and
yeah.
If you'd have told me, like, oh, what if Cannibal Corpse put in a more melodic guitar player? It isn't, like, the first thing that I would want Cannibal Corpse to do, but he adds that kind of tritone in the background in big moments, like Bloodblind has quite a lot of it, and it adds that sort of devilish quality to it, which...
Yeah, it reminds me a bit of, like, when Ralph Santola joined Deicide around, like, Stentor Redemption era, and suddenly they had all, like, these really fucking sweeping, amazing melodic guitar solos in what was already ferocious Deicide, and you go, oh man, that's a real juicy combo.
Yeah, or even just, like, when he's not taking the role, that obviously, like, Drain You Empty, which just as a song title.
Drain You Empty!
Fucking hell. Like, for a record that never slows down, and when it does, it's, like, Bloodblind and Souls Out, which is just still unbelievably heavy and brutal. For that to then come with that devilish, doomy riff, it's like the collapse at the end of the marathon, and now the Horde's gonna get you.
They do those bits really well. Like, they really, like, the Frenzied Feeding and Bloodblind, they both, those parts when the guitars just go, like, really low and churning amid, like, the chaos. It's like, oh, that it finds ways to lurch into these really, like, genuinely queasy sort of slightly staccato chug parts amid it all.
Yeah, and then when that song gets going again, and that riff is just like gung, 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 gung,
Like that beat down almost like to it.
Yeah, like a fast up-tempo beat down. An up-tempo beat down, what does that even mean?
Yeah.
And yet it feels like glorious. Like, it's maybe my favourite song on the record, and for that to come at the end, I was going to say it leaves a good taste in the mouth. I don't know if that's appropriate for Cannibal Corpse, or a song called Drain You Empty, but it just leaves you so satisfied.
I read a headline in the news the other day about a guy who fell into one of those like geyser pools they have in Yellowstone and literally dissolved. That's what that song sounds like.
Yeah.
And that's a positive review.
Sorry to that guy, you know. They just have this. They have this amazing way, beyond like most death metal bands still coming through now, of just like making you literally like tighten your fists and like clench your muscles when they're moving forward, and just the act of moving along with them is like so white knuckle. It's a difficult trick to replicate. No, just get like a genuine sense of thrill and constant excitement. You know, death metal is past doing that inherently. You've got to kind of have that in the playing. And always with a new Cannibal Corpse album, there'll be like 5 or 6 songs I want for sure in the set because they slam so hard, and they'll do 3 of them. And this might not on the surface seem like it has the hit power of a Kill or a Violence Unimagined, but there are those 5 or 6 songs easily that you definitely want to hear, and that's not to sniff at the rest of it. The only downside is, I guess, I'm reminded of when we reviewed the Black Dahlia Murder's last record, Verminous, on this podcast, obviously a long time ago now, but we raved about it, and then Bees and I agreed. We were like, it's a record more for Black Dahlia Murder fans, while the previous one, Nightbringers, was just a metal record that you'd rave about to anybody and insist they listen to. That's a quite comparable scenario here, I think, with these 2 records. But I love Verminous, and I think Chaos Horrific is pretty fucking sick also.
Yeah, I think this isn't going to grab people in the way that Violence Unimagined does, but again, maybe if you've already got them with that, then you can kind of go like, now here's just, you know, the gnarly shit to go along with it. And I think that's a great pairing.
I think this might be the first Cannibal Corpse record since Kill, which doesn't have one of those genuine, like, ironclad instant classics like Inhumane Harvest or Kill and Become and Code of the Slashers, Scourge of Iron, Evisceration, yada yada. But I think as an album experience, it's great. And if I were to rank the records, yeah, I wouldn't have it as high as Violence Unimagined or Torture or what have you. But I'd probably have it comparable to the likes of Gallery of Suicide and Gore Obsessed, which are both records I think are fucking wicked. So, like I say, even if I was to put this at like the 10th best Cannibal Corpse record, that's staggeringly good praise. Like, not only just this far in, but just for any album.